March 15, 1968, Cedar Falls, Iowa. Twin brothers Danny and David Morrison shared everything until they met Sarah Chen at Murphy's Diner. That spring night, only one brother walked out alive. 53 years later, forensic genealogy would finally reveal which twin survived. Danny and David Morrison stand identical in their Ford dealership coveralls, but anyone who knows them can spot the differences. Danny laughs louder, drinks harder, and carries himself like he's owed something by the world. David speaks softer, saves his money, and dreams of opening his own garage someday. At 24, they've shared everything since birth, the same crib, the same friends, even the same girlfriends, until things got serious enough that one would step aside. That changes the moment Sarah Chen walks into Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday in February. She's barely 5 feet tall with hair black as motor oil and a smile that makes the coffee taste sweeter. Fresh from California, she's saving money for nursing school and doesn't know about the Morrison twins' reputation for friendly competition over pretty girls. The chrome-trimmed Mustangs and Camaros gleam in Murphy's parking lot under the buzzing neon sign. Inside, red vinyl booths line the windows, and the jukebox plays The Way You Look Tonight on endless repeat because someone keeps feeding it quarters. Sarah moves between tables with practiced grace, her uniform crisp despite the long shift, always finding time to ask about customers' families or remember how they take their coffee. Danny claims the corner booth every evening after work, ordering pie he doesn't want just to watch Sarah write down his order. Her handwriting is small and neat like everything else about her. When she laughs at his jokes, he feels 10 feet tall. David arrives 20 minutes later, sliding into the opposite seat with a quieter charm, asking Sarah about her classes at the community college, remembering details about her textbooks and her worries about chemistry. The brothers don't discuss Sarah directly, but the tension builds like steam in a radiator. Danny starts showering after work instead of waiting until morning. David trades shifts to match Sarah's schedule. They both know the rules of their unspoken game. The prettier the girl, the higher the stakes, but family comes first. Always. Sarah seems oblivious to the competition, treating both brothers with the same warmth she shows every customer. She mentions wanting to visit the quarry everyone talks about, says she's never seen limestone cliffs up close. Danny immediately offers to drive her in his Chevelle. David suggests they all go together, make it a picnic. The jukebox needle skips on The Way You Look Tonight as Sarah refills their coffee cups for the third time. Her fingers brush David's hand when she sets down the cream pitcher, and Danny notices the way his brother's ears turn red. For the first time in their lives, stepping aside doesn't feel like an option. Murphy's Diner becomes their battlefield, fought with better tips, funnier stories, and careful attention to which brother makes Sarah smile brighter. The other customers start placing bets on which Morrison twin will win the new waitress. The smart money's on David, he's the steady one, the type girls marry, but Danny's got that dangerous edge some women find irresistible. By March, Sarah accepts dates with both brothers, unaware she's lighting a fuse that's been burning since they shared their first breath. The competition that once brought them closer now drives a wedge deeper with every shared smile, every laugh, every moment when she chooses one twin's company over the others. The jukebox plays their song, the coffee grows cold, and neither brother realizes they're about to lose everything that matters. Some competitions have no winners, only survivors. March 15th arrives grey and cold, with the kind of Iowa wind that cuts through jacket seams and rattles diner windows. Sarah works the evening shift, her movements more mechanical than usual, like she's carrying invisible weight. The Marlboro smoke from the truckers section mingles with the smell of bacon grease and industrial coffee, creating the particular atmosphere that makes Murphy's feel like the loneliest place in Cedar Falls. Danny arrives first, sliding into their usual corner booth with nervous energy crackling around him like static electricity. His hands shake slightly as he lights a lucky strike, the flame revealing scratches across his knuckles that weren't there yesterday. When Sarah brings his coffee, he grabs her wrist gently but firmly. "We need to talk tonight, after your shift. It's important, Sarah." His voice carries an edge she's never heard before, something desperate and final. David enters as the AM radio crackles with updates from Vietnam, Johnson's voice discussing peace talks that everyone knows won't amount to much. He looks exhausted, dark circles under eyes that mirror his brother's perfectly, but his demeanor seems calmer, more resolved. He nods at Danny but doesn't join him, instead taking a stool at the counter where Sarah can't avoid him. "Sarah, honey, we can't keep doing this," David says quietly when she pours his coffee. "You know what I'm talking about, this thing between the three of us, it's tearing everything apart." Sarah's hand trembles as she sets down the pot. The other customers pretend not to watch, but Murphy's isn't big enough for real privacy. Everyone knows the Morrison twins have been circling the new waitress like moths around a flame, and everyone's waiting to see which one gets burned. The dinner rush passes in strained silence. Sarah drops a plate of meatloaf, something she's never done before. Danny orders pie and doesn't touch it. David sits nursing the same cup of coffee for 2 hours, reading a newspaper without turning the pages. The jukebox seems stuck on melancholy songs, yesterday, and the sound of silence, as if even the machine senses the ending coming. At 9:30, Sarah hangs up her apron with shaking hands. The brothers watch her every movement, and she feels caught between them like prey between predators. When she finally approaches their booth, her voice comes out smaller than intended. "I've been thinking about what you both said about choosing." She twists her hands in front of her, looking everywhere except their faces. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be the reason you two hate each other." Danny's chair scrapes against linoleum as he stands. "So what are you saying? You're picking him?" The accusation hangs heavy in the cigarette-thick air. "I'm not picking anyone. I'm leaving Cedar Falls. I got accepted to a nursing program in Chicago. I start in June." The words hit both brothers like physical blows. David's coffee cup cracks in his grip. Danny's cigarette burns down to his fingers without him noticing. Sarah retrieves her coat from behind the counter, moving like she might run if they say the wrong thing. "Don't make any decisions tonight," David says finally. "Let's all go up to the quarry, talk this through like adults." Sarah's eyes dart toward the exit, but Danny's already moving to block her path. Not aggressively, but with the kind of casual positioning that makes retreat impossible. "Good idea," Danny says, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Clear the air like old times." They drive to the quarry in David's blue Impala, Sarah between the brothers on the bench seat, none of them speaking over the radio's static and the engine's rumble. The limestone cliffs rise pale and ghostly in the headlights, and the quarry water reflects stars like scattered coins. What happens next will haunt Cedar Falls for 53 years, told in whispers and half-remembered fragments. 3 people park at the quarry's edge that night. Only 2 come back to town in the morning, and nothing is ever the same again. The morning after brings news that spreads through Cedar Falls like spilled coffee, dark and impossible to clean up completely. David Morrison returns alone, his blue Impala sporting a dented fender and his usual quiet demeanor replaced by something hollow and shaken. He tells anyone who asks that Danny decided to leave for California, said he needed a fresh start away from Iowa and all its limitations. Sarah doesn't return to Murphy's diner. She calls in sick, then simply doesn't call at all. When her landlady checks the apartment above the fabric store, she finds Sarah's belongings gone except for a note saying she decided to take the Chicago nursing program early. The timing seems convenient, almost too neat, but Sheriff Kowalski finds no evidence of foul play and plenty of witnesses who heard the brothers arguing about Sarah's departure. David, at least the brother identifying himself as David, moves through the following weeks like a man underwater. His co-workers at the Ford dealership notice changes they can't quite name. He smokes different cigarettes now, Luckies instead of Marlboros. He laughs at different jokes. His handwriting on work orders looks somehow altered, more angular than before. But grief changes people, everyone agrees. Losing a twin brother must be like losing half your soul. 2 months later, Sarah returns to Cedar Falls quietly, on a greyhound that arrives at dawn. She looks thinner, more fragile, like something precious that's been dropped and carefully glued back together. The gossip mill churns with speculation about her sudden departure and equally sudden return, but Sarah offers no explanations to anyone except David. They marry in August at the small Lutheran church where the Morrison family has attended for 3 generations. Sarah wears her mother's simple white dress, altered hastily to fit her diminished frame. David stands at the altar in his father's suit, and if his smile seems forced, everyone attributes it to the lingering sadness of his brother's absence. The wedding party consists of Sarah's sister from Des Moines and David's cousin from Waterloo. No one mentions the empty space where Danny should have been standing. The couple settles into the small house on Elm Street that David inherited from his grandmother. Sarah plants a garden with tomatoes and marigolds while David works construction, his gentle nature apparently suited for the physical demands of building other people's dreams. Neighbors occasionally comment that marriage has changed him, made him seem somehow more intense, quicker to anger when frustrated. But Sarah appears happy enough, though she maintains a careful distance from the social circles she'd begun forming before her brief departure. Their wood-paneled station wagon becomes a familiar sight around town, David driving Sarah to her new job at the county hospital, where she works as a nurse's aide. Evening television brings Walter Cronkite into their living room, his steady voice reporting on a world that seems increasingly turbulent while their own lives settle into routine. Sarah prepares meals with the methodical precision of someone following a script, and David eats them while reading newspapers cover to cover, as if searching for news of someone who might never return. The questions linger beneath the surface of their marriage like sediment in still water. Sarah sometimes stares at her husband with an expression that suggests she's solving a puzzle with missing pieces. David catches her looking and his face shifts, just for an instant, before resuming its careful mask of contentment. They build their life on a foundation of things unsaid, creating the kind of marriage that functions perfectly from the outside while slowly hollowing itself from within. When neighbors ask about Danny, David's response never varies. His brother is somewhere in California, probably Los Angeles, working construction and enjoying the weather. He might send a postcard someday, David says, but Danny was never much for keeping in touch. The story becomes accepted truth through repetition, filed away with other family mysteries that small towns accumulate like dust. But Sarah never stops looking over her shoulder, never stops studying her husband's face in unguarded moments, never stops wondering about the subtle differences she can't quite name but can't ignore either. Something changed that night at the quarry, something fundamental about the man she married. Love means accepting mysteries, she tells herself, but some mysteries feel less like romance and more like survival. By 1975, the Morrison family appears picture-perfect in their Christmas card, 2 children flanking parents who have learned to smile at precisely the right moments. 7-year-old Michelle has her mother's dark hair and serious eyes, while 5-year-old Tommy mirrors his father's features so completely that neighbors joke about Morrison genes running strong. Sarah has gained back the weight she lost during those mysterious months in 1968, settling into the comfortable curves of motherhood and middle age. David Morrison Construction has become modestly successful, building ranch houses and split levels for Cedar Falls' growing middle class. David himself has grown broader, more solid, his gentle nature from the early years occasionally giving way to flashes of impatience that surprise everyone, including Sarah. When he's frustrated with a difficult client or a supply delay, he'll slam tools down with sudden violence, then apologize immediately as if shocked by his own behavior. The family builds their dream house on the old Morrison property, 5 acres of farmland that's been in the family since the 1890s. David insists on doing most of the work himself, spending long evenings and weekends laying foundation, framing walls, installing plumbing. He seems particularly focused on the basement, measuring and remeasuring, pouring concrete with meticulous care that borders on obsession. Sarah watches her husband work from the kitchen window of their temporary trailer, tang orange drink sweating in her glass as Iowa summer heat shimmers off the construction site. She notices how David avoids certain areas of the property, how he redirects the children when they wander too close to the old oak tree near the back fence. Tommy asks once about building a tree house there, and David's refusal comes sharp and final, brooking no discussion. The new house takes shape slowly, David working with the methodical precision of a man who understands that some projects can't be rushed. The basement becomes his workshop, lined with pegboard and equipped with every tool imaginable. But Sarah notices he rarely spends time there after dark, preferring to keep his evening projects upstairs or in the garage. When she mentions this observation, David changes the subject with the kind of casual deflection he's mastered over 7 years of marriage. Their shag carpeting is the color of autumn leaves, and the rotary phone in the kitchen gets constant use as Sarah coordinates carpools and dinner plans with other mothers in their new neighborhood. The children adapt quickly, Michelle excelling in school while Tommy shows an early aptitude for building things with his hands, just like his father. Family dinners happen promptly at 6, David reading the Cedar Falls Gazette, while Sarah serves casseroles and vegetables from her carefully tended garden. But certain subjects remain off-limits in the Morrison household, boundaries that grew stronger rather than weaker as years passed. The children learn not to ask about Uncle Danny, accepting vague explanations about him living far away and being bad at staying in touch. They don't question why there are no photographs of their father's twin brother, why Christmas cards never include California postmarks, why their grandmother sometimes looks confused when Danny's name comes up in conversation. Michelle develops an early sensitivity to these unspoken rules, the kind of careful awareness that oldest children learn when family peace depends on avoiding certain topics. She notices how her mother's face changes during those rare moments when someone mentions the early days of her parents' marriage, how conversations die when neighbors bring up the old stories about the Morrison twins and the waitress from Murphy's Diner. Tommy, younger and less observant, accepts the family mythology without question. To him, Uncle Danny is simply an abstract concept, like distant relatives in family trees studied at school. But Michelle stores up small inconsistencies the way some children collect stamps, sensing that the gaps in family stories might someday prove significant. The house settles into its foundation through winter frosts and spring thaws, becoming solid and permanent while the family inside learns to navigate around the spaces where truth should be. David's workshop grows more elaborate each year, filled with projects that seem designed more to occupy his hands than to serve any practical purpose. Sarah tends her garden with increasing dedication, as if growing things might somehow compensate for whatever lies buried in their family's past. Years pass in suburban rhythm, marked by school plays and little league games, birthday parties and summer vacations to lakes where the children learn to swim while their parents watch from lawn chairs. ice-cold beer sweating in their hands like secrets waiting to be told. The diagnosis comes in February 2018, delivered in the sterile comfort of the county hospital where Sarah has worked for 37 years. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, the kind of news that makes calendars irrelevant and reduces life to a series of smaller measurements, weeks, maybe months, certainly not years. At 72, Sarah Morrison faces mortality with the same methodical calm she's applied to every crisis since 1968. Michelle drives down from Minneapolis, where she works as a financial advisor, her own 2 children grown and scattered to colleges on opposite coasts. At 50, she has her mother's serious eyes and her father's stubborn chin, though she's never been quite sure where her questioning nature comes from. Tommy arrives from Denver with his wife and teenage daughter, the Morrison genes strong in another generation of broad shoulders and gentle smiles. David, now 74, moves through his wife's illness with careful attention, driving her to appointments, filling pill organizers, adjusting pillows with the kind of precise care he once applied to construction projects. But Michelle notices something she's never seen before in her father's face, relief mixed with the expected grief, as if Sarah's approaching death might finally resolve some long-standing debt. The morphine drip provides blessed distance from pain, but it also loosens the careful restraint Sarah has maintained for half a century. During one of their last conversations, Michelle sits beside the hospital bed while rain patters against windows, the kind of Iowa spring storm that turns the world gray and introspective. "Michelle, honey, there's something I need you to know," Sarah begins, her voice thin but determined. "About your father, about how we really met." The story comes in fragments, interrupted by pain medication and the careful habit of decades. Sarah describes the competition between the twins, the night at the quarry, the months she spent hiding in Chicago while trying to decide what to believe about which brother survived. She explains the subtle differences she noticed immediately: different cigarettes, altered handwriting, small behavioral changes that might mean nothing or everything. "I was never completely sure which twin came back to me," Sarah whispers, gripping Michelle's hand with surprising strength. "The physical similarities were perfect, but something fundamental had changed. I married him anyway because I was scared and alone and needed to believe in love more than I needed to understand it." Michelle feels the foundation of her understanding shifting like unstable ground. "Mom, are you saying Dad might not be Dad?" "I'm saying I've lived 50 years wondering if I married my fiancé or his brother, if my children's father is the man I thought I fell in love with or someone who took his place." Sarah's eyes focus with clarity that cuts through the medication's fog. "I'm saying some questions are too dangerous to ask when the answers might destroy everything you've built." The confession hangs between them like a challenge, and Michelle realizes she's been preparing for this moment her entire life without knowing it. Every family inconsistency, every careful omission, every moment when her father's behavior seemed slightly off register, they form a pattern now, a puzzle that might finally have enough pieces to solve. Sarah dies 3 days later, leaving behind photo albums filled with faded color prints from the 1970s and 1980s, images of family vacations and birthday parties where everyone smiles at precisely the right moments. Michelle finds herself studying these photographs with new eyes, searching for clues in facial expressions and body language, wondering if the man who raised her with patient love might be someone else entirely. The funeral draws the entire town of Cedar Falls, neighbors and co-workers sharing memories of Sarah's kindness and dedication. David accepts condolences with appropriate grief, but Michelle watches him carefully now, noting how his responses seem rehearsed, how he deflects specific questions about their early marriage with the same casual skill he's employed for decades. Standing at the graveside, Michelle realizes she's inherited more than her mother's jewelry and recipe collection. She's inherited a mystery that demands resolution, a question that Sarah was too afraid or too kind to pursue. But Michelle has grown up in an age of DNA testing and computer databases, digital tools that can illuminate even the most carefully buried secrets. The truth may be 50 years old, but it's not dead yet. Sometimes it just takes the right technology and enough courage to dig. Michelle's internet search begins at midnight on a Tuesday in October 2019, 8 months after her mother's funeral. She sits in her Minneapolis townhouse, laptop glowing in the darkness, typing queries that would have seemed like science fiction when her parents married. DNA testing identical twins, forensic genealogy services, distinguishing between identical siblings, each search leading deeper into a rabbit hole of genetic science and criminal investigation. Dr. Amanda Torres operates her forensic genealogy consulting firm from a converted warehouse in Chicago, the same city where Sarah Morrison once spent 3 mysterious months in 1968. At 38, Amanda represents a new generation of scientific detective, combining traditional genealogy research with cutting-edge DNA analysis to solve cold cases that seemed impossible just decades earlier. Michelle's phone call catches Amanda during her lunch break, surrounded by case files and computer monitors displaying complex family trees. "The technology you're asking about is relatively new," Amanda explains, her voice carrying the professional warmth of someone accustomed to explaining complex concepts to grieving families. Identical twins start with the same DNA, but over time they accumulate different mutations, environmental damage, copying errors during cell division, changes that make them distinguishable at the molecular level. The science sounds like magic to Michelle, but Amanda breaks it down methodically. DNA profiling, first developed in 1984, revolutionized criminal investigation by identifying individuals through genetic fingerprints. But identical twins posed a unique challenge because they shared the same basic genetic code. Only recently have scientists learned to detect the subtle differences that accumulate over decades of separate existence. "We'd need samples from both your father and your uncle," Amanda continues. "If your uncle is deceased, that complicates things, but bone or tooth samples can preserve DNA for decades under the right conditions." Michelle stares at Polaroid photos spread across her coffee table, family construction projects from the 1970s, her father's careful documentation of building their house on the old Morrison property. Something about his meticulous attention to the basement foundation suddenly seems less like pride and more like concealment. "There's another technology that might help," Amanda suggests. Ground-penetrating radar was originally developed in the 1960s for geological surveys, but forensic applications weren't refined until much later. If there are remains on your family property, GPR can locate them without disturbing the site. The conversation lasts 2 hours, Amanda patiently explaining the limitations and possibilities while Michelle grapples with the implications. Forensic genealogy has solved dozens of cold cases in recent years, identifying suspects through distant relatives who submitted DNA to ancestry websites, connecting crimes across decades through genetic relationships the perpetrators never imagined could be traced. But Michelle's case presents unique challenges. If her suspicions prove correct, she's not just solving a mystery, she's potentially exposing her father as a murderer and herself as the daughter of a man who stole his brother's identity. The emotional mathematics become staggering. How do you weigh 50 years of genuine love against the possibility that it was all built on deception? Amanda's fees are substantial but not impossible, the cost of scientific certainty measured against a lifetime of questions. Michelle finds herself calculating not just financial expense but emotional risk, wondering if some truths are too dangerous to pursue, if her mother's decision to live with uncertainty might have been wiser than she initially thought. The decision crystallizes during a phone call with Tommy, her brother still processing their mother's death and resistant to Michelle's growing obsession with family mysteries. "Let it go, Michelle. Dad's 74 years old. Mom's gone. What's the point of digging up ancient history?" But Michelle has inherited her mother's nursing precision and her father's, whoever he is, construction worker's persistence. Some foundations need to be excavated before new structures can be built safely. Some questions demand answers even when the asking might destroy everything built on their silence. She sends Amanda Torres a retainer check on a Thursday morning, officially beginning an investigation that will either confirm her father's identity or expose 50 years of carefully maintained deception. The technology exists now to distinguish between identical twins, to find remains buried beneath basement floors, to illuminate secrets that once seemed permanently hidden. Truth may be expensive and dangerous, but ignorance has become impossible. The past is about to meet the present, and Michelle Morrison is about to learn which twin raised her with patient love for half a century. The ground-penetrating radar arrives on a trailer behind Amanda Torres' pickup truck, looking more like construction equipment than scientific instrumentation. The November sky hangs grey and heavy over the Morrison property, where David watches from the kitchen window as technicians calibrate their equipment. His coffee grows cold in hands that tremble slightly, though he attributes the shaking to age rather than anxiety. Michelle has told him about hiring the genealogy consultant, framing the investigation as closure after her mother's deathbed confusion rather than active suspicion of his identity. David accepted this explanation with the same careful neutrality he's applied to uncomfortable topics for 51 years, but his sleep has grown restless, filled with dreams of limestone quarries and blue impalas gleaming under starlight. Amanda moves across the property with scientific precision, marking grid coordinates while her assistant operates the radar unit. The technology works by sending electromagnetic pulses into the ground and measuring the echoes that bounce back from buried objects, creating a subsurface map of anomalies that might indicate disturbed soil or foreign materials. The basement addition was built in 1975, Michelle explains, consulting her father's meticulous construction photos. Dad did most of the work himself, including pouring the concrete foundation. The radar operator adjusts his equipment settings, optimizing for the soil conditions and depth range they're investigating. Ground-penetrating radar has evolved significantly since its 1960s origins in geological surveying, with modern units capable of detecting objects buried several meters deep. But the technology has limitations. Clay soil reduces penetration depth, and metallic objects can create false readings that complicate interpretation. David joins them outside, moving with the careful deliberation of an elderly man trying to appear casual while his world potentially crumbles around him. "Find anything interesting?" he asks, lighting a lucky strike with hands steadier than they have any right to be. "Still scanning," Amanda replies professionally. "GPR generates a lot of data that needs careful analysis. Most anomalies turn out to be tree roots, old utility lines, natural rock formations, perfectly innocent explanations." But 20 minutes later, the equipment detects something that makes Amanda's assistant stop the scan and call her over. The radar signature shows a distinct anomaly approximately 6 feet below the basement floor, roughly the size and shape of human remains. More significantly, the surrounding soil shows signs of disturbance consistent with a grave site filled and compacted decades earlier. Michelle feels her world tilt as Amanda explains what they're seeing on the computer screen. The green and yellow patterns mean nothing to untrained eyes, but Amanda's interpretation carries the weight of dozens of similar investigations. "This could be what we're looking for, but we'll need professional excavation to confirm anything." David's cigarette burns down to his fingers without him noticing, the small pain insignificant compared to the larger agony of watching his carefully constructed life begin its final collapse. When Michelle looks at him with new understanding in her eyes, he sees his wife's expression from their wedding day, loving but uncertain, committed but questioning. The call to sheriff's department takes place from Michelle's cell phone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she's potentially unleashing. Detective Ray Kowalski, grandson of the sheriff who handled the original missing person report in 1968, arrives within an hour with a crime scene team and excavation equipment. The basement floor yields reluctantly to jackhammers and shovels, 51 years of concrete, and time refusing to give up their secrets easily. David stands in his own backyard watching strangers tear apart the foundation he built with his own hands, his face carrying the expression of a man witnessing his own execution. 6 feet down, wrapped in canvas that disintegrates at first touch, they find what remains of David Morrison, the real David Morrison, who never made it home from the quarry that March night in 1968. His Ford dealership work shirt has survived better than flesh, the company logo still visible on fabric stained dark with decades of decay. Dental records confirm identity within hours, and suddenly everyone understands that the man they've known as David Morrison for 51 years has been someone else entirely. Danny Morrison, the twin with the quick temper and desperate heart, who killed his brother for love and then lived his brother's life with such convincing dedication that even his wife was never completely certain of the deception. The confession comes that evening in the interview room at the county jail, Danny Morrison finally admitting to 5 decades of carefully maintained lies. His voice carries the weariness of a man who's been holding his breath for 51 years, finally able to exhale. Danny Morrison sits in the interview room wearing the same flannel shirt he was gardening in when the handcuffs clicked around his wrists 6 hours earlier. At 74, he looks older than his years, the weight of 5 decades of deception carved into lines around his eyes. Detective Ray Kowalski reads him his rights with the careful precision of someone who understands they're documenting history, not just processing another arrest. "I want to tell you what really happened that night," Danny begins, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who's been carrying a secret too heavy for one person to bear. "Not the story I've been telling for 51 years, the truth." The confession unfolds slowly, interrupted by long pauses where Danny stares at his hands as if seeing them clearly for the first time. He describes the mounting tension between the brothers, how their competition over Sarah had poisoned every interaction, turning shared meals into battlegrounds and casual conversations into strategic maneuvers. "David said he was going to tell Sarah about my drinking, about the times I'd lost my temper and put holes in walls. He said she deserved to know what kind of man she was considering marrying." Danny's laugh carries no humor, just the bitter recognition of irony. "He was trying to protect her from me and I killed him for it." The physical confrontation at the quarry lasted less than 5 minutes but changed everything forever. Danny describes pushing his brother during an argument, David falling and striking his head on limestone rocks, the terrible silence that followed as Danny realized what he'd done. The blood looked black in the Impala's headlights, spreading across pale stone like spilled motor oil. I panicked. David was unconscious, maybe dead, I couldn't tell, but Sarah was crying, saying she was going to call for help, and I knew my life was over. Danny closes his eyes, remembering details he spent decades trying to forget. I hit her, not hard, just enough to knock her out, buy myself time to think. The improvised plan emerged from desperation rather than calculation. Danny loaded his brother's body into the Impala's trunk while Sarah lay unconscious, then drove her to the bus station in Des Moines, buying her a ticket to Chicago and leaving her purse beside the bench with enough cash for a fresh start. By the time she woke up, she was 3 hours from Cedar Falls with no memory of how she'd gotten there. I figured she'd start over, maybe decide Iowa wasn't worth coming back to. I could be David, live his life, and nobody would ever know the difference. Danny shakes his head at his younger self's naive confidence. I didn't count on loving her enough to want her back or her loving David enough to return. The months between Sarah's departure and return became Danny's crash course in becoming his twin brother. He studied David's handwriting, practiced his gentler mannerisms, learned to smoke Marlboros instead of Lucky Strikes. The physical similarities were perfect, but personality required constant vigilance, careful attention to responses David would have given rather than the ones that came naturally. Sarah's return forced Danny to maintain the deception indefinitely, building a marriage on the foundation of his brother's grave. He describes the psychological exhaustion of constant performance, never being able to relax completely, always monitoring his behavior for slips that might reveal the truth. She knew something was different, not consciously maybe, but some part of her always suspected. The way she'd study my face sometimes like she was trying to solve a puzzle. Danny's voice breaks slightly. 50 years I spent trying to be worthy of loving me as David, and she was too smart to be completely fooled. Detective Kowalski asks about the construction of the house, the careful placement of David's grave beneath the basement foundation. Danny explains his reasoning with the methodical precision of someone who's had decades to refine the details. The basement location provided permanent concealment, while allowing him to maintain psychological connection to his brother, visiting the grave daily without anyone suspecting. I told myself I was protecting everyone, Sarah from the truth, my children from having a murderer for a father, myself from prison, but really I was just a coward who couldn't face the consequences of what I'd done. Danny looks directly at Detective Kowalski for the first time. David was the better man. Sarah should have married David. My children should have had David for a father. The interview lasts 4 hours, Danny providing details that only the real killer could know, answering questions about evidence and timeline with accuracy that removes any doubt about his guilt. When it's finished, he seems smaller somehow, as if confession has physically diminished him. Outside, Michelle waits in her car, processing the reality that the man who taught her to ride a bicycle and attended every school play is a murderer who stole her uncle's identity before she was born. The mathematics of love and deception become impossible to calculate when 50 years of genuine affection must be weighed against the ultimate betrayal. The Cedar Falls courthouse hasn't seen this much media attention since the grain elevator explosion of 1987. News vans line the street outside the limestone building, where justice moves with small-town deliberation, unhurried by the cameras and reporters drawn by a story that seems pulled from vintage crime magazines. Danny Morrison, age 75, sits at the defendant's table wearing a suit borrowed from the public defender's office, looking every inch the grandfather he's been to Michelle's children for 20 years. Michelle occupies the front row behind the prosecution, her presence a living reminder of the complexity that surrounds this case. She's the daughter of a murderer and the niece of his victim, raised with love by the man who killed her uncle before she was born. Tommy sits beside her, still struggling to accept that their entire family history requires rewriting, that every childhood memory must be re-examined through the lens of their father's deception. The prosecutor, an earnest young woman named Jennifer Walsh, presents the case with textbook precision. Physical evidence, DNA confirmation, detailed confession, the guilt is established beyond reasonable doubt. But the sentencing phase proves more complicated when character witnesses describe 5 decades of Danny Morrison living as a model citizen, devoted husband, loving father, and respected member of the community. Your Honor, testifies Margaret Chen, Sarah's younger sister who moved to Cedar Falls in 1995. He took care of Sarah through her cancer with devotion I've rarely seen. Whatever he did 50 years ago, he spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. The defense attorney, a silver-haired veteran named Robert Hayes, doesn't dispute the facts but argues for understanding. This was a crime of passion followed by 50 years of remorse demonstrated through exemplary living. Danny Morrison built a life dedicated to honoring the brother he killed, raising children who remember him only as a loving father, and contributing to a community that trusted him completely. Dr. Patricia Williams, a forensic psychologist called as an expert witness, explains the psychological torture of maintaining such an elaborate deception. Living as someone else requires constant vigilance, suppression of natural personality traits, ongoing stress that most people couldn't sustain. The fact that Mr. Morrison maintained this identity successfully for 5 decades while building genuine relationships suggests profound psychological commitment to making amends. Michelle takes the witness stand during the sentencing phase, her testimony, the emotional center of proceedings that have drawn national attention. She speaks carefully, each word weighted with the complexity of loving someone who destroyed her family before she existed. "I don't know how to separate the father who raised me from the man who killed my uncle," she begins, her voice steady despite the cameras and courtroom tension. "He taught me to drive, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, held my babies when they were born, but he also buried his brother under our house and built our family on that grave." The courtroom falls silent as Michelle describes growing up with subtle inconsistencies she couldn't name, the careful way certain topics were avoided, her mother's occasional looks of confusion when studying her husband's face. "My mother died wondering if she'd married the right twin. I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if the man I called Dad ever existed, or if he was just Danny Morrison's idea of who David should have been." Judge Patricia Henley, 73 years old and nearing retirement, has presided over 3 decades of cases but nothing approaching this emotional complexity. The legal precedents are clear: murder in the first degree, identity theft, fraud, but the human elements defy easy categorization. How do you sentence a man who committed murder at 24 but spent the next 50 years living as a devoted family man? The victim impact statements prove particularly wrenching. Michelle reads a letter she wrote to the uncle she never met, apologizing for enjoying the childhood that should have belonged to his children, for calling another man dad while David Morrison lay buried beneath their basement floor. Tommy, still processing his shattered understanding of family history, speaks about the impossibility of grieving for a father who turns out to have been someone else entirely. "I loved the man who raised me," Tommy says, his voice breaking, "but I hate the man who killed my uncle. I don't know how to hold both truths at the same time." The prosecution argues for maximum sentencing despite Danny's age and health concerns. "This wasn't just murder," Jennifer Walsh tells the court. "This was the theft of an entire identity, a 50-year deception that denied the victim proper burial, denied his family closure, and built multiple generations of relationships on false foundations." But the defense counters with evidence of genuine transformation, decades of community service, charitable giving done anonymously, a life lived in apparent penance for youthful violence. Character witnesses describe a man who seemed driven to help others, as if making amends for some unnamed wrong that only he fully understood. Dr. Amanda Torres testifies about the forensic genealogy that cracked the case, explaining how modern technology can finally distinguish between identical twins through accumulated genetic mutations. "Science has given us tools to solve cases that seemed impossible just a decade ago, but it can't resolve the emotional complexity of families built on secrets." The courthouse flag hangs at half-mast for unrelated reasons, but it seems appropriate for proceedings that feel more like a funeral than a trial. Local reporters with film cameras document every moment, understanding they're witnessing the end of a story that began in 1968 with 2 brothers competing for the same woman's love. When Judge Henley finally renders her decision, the courtroom holds its breath. The court finds that while Mr. Morrison has lived an exemplary life for 5 decades, the severity of his crimes demands accountability. Murder cannot be erased by good deeds, no matter how numerous or sincere. Life in prison without possibility of parole. At 75, it amounts to a death sentence, which perhaps seems fitting for a man who's been dead in all but name since March 15, 1968. Danny Morrison accepts the verdict without expression, as if he's been expecting this moment for 51 years. Outside the courthouse, Michelle faces reporters' questions about forgiveness, about whether she can separate the loving father from the murderous brother, about what happens to a family when its entire foundation proves false. Her answers are careful, measured, the responses of someone still processing revelations that change everything she thought she knew about love, identity, and truth. Danny Morrison dies in his cell at the Iowa State Penitentiary 6 months after sentencing, his heart finally giving out under the weight of secrets he no longer has to carry. The death certificate lists his name correctly for the first time in 51 years, though few people understand the significance of that particular accuracy. Michelle receives the call on a Tuesday morning while preparing breakfast for her visiting grandchildren, the mundane routine of scrambled eggs and orange juice suddenly interrupted by the final chapter of her family's long deception. The funeral draws a surprising crowd to Cedar Falls, neighbors and former co-workers who remember David Morrison, the man they thought they knew, as a devoted husband and community member. The cognitive dissonance proves overwhelming for many attendees, who struggle to reconcile decades of positive memories with the revelation that they'd been mourning the wrong twin all along. Michelle stands at the graveside beside a headstone that reads Daniel Morrison, 1944-2020, beloved father and husband, the inscription representing a compromise between legal accuracy and emotional truth. Tommy chose not to attend, still unable to process the psychological complexity of grieving for a father who never existed while learning to hate the man who actually raised him. The house on the Morrison property sits empty now, its basement foundation forever marked by the excavation site where David Morrison's remains were finally recovered and given proper burial. Michelle has tried twice to sell the property, but potential buyers inevitably learn the history and withdraw their offers. Some foundations are too stained by the past to support new construction. Instead, she donates the land to the city with specific instructions that it become a memorial garden, a quiet space where people can contemplate the complexity of human nature and the consequences of choices made in moments of desperate passion. The old oak tree near the back fence, which Danny always forbade the children from climbing, becomes the centerpiece of the memorial, its branches offering shade to visitors seeking to understand how love and violence can coexist in the same heart. Sarah Morrison's nursing scholarship at the community college grows into a permanent endowment, funded by the sale of Danny's construction business and the modest savings he accumulated over 50 years of careful living. Michelle finds peace in honoring her mother this way, creating something positive from the ruins of their family's deception. Each year, 3 students receive financial assistance to pursue nursing careers, their education built on money earned through a lifetime of penance. The handwritten letters Michelle discovers in Danny's prison cell, never sent but carefully preserved, provide some measure of understanding about the psychological burden he carried for 5 decades. Addressed to David, to Sarah, and to his children, they reveal a man tormented by guilt, but unable to confess without destroying the lives built on his deception. "I tried to be worthy of the love you gave me," reads one letter addressed to Michelle. "I tried to be the father David would have been, the husband he should have been. I know now that pretending to be a good man isn't the same as actually being one, but it was the only way I knew to honor what I'd taken from all of you." The pressed flowers Michelle finds in Sarah's Bible tell their own story, wildflowers from the quarry where everything changed, preserved between the pages of Psalms like evidence of a crime that was also somehow a love story. Her mother kept these flowers for 50 years, a secret acknowledgement of the night that destroyed one life and created another, the moment when Sarah Chen lost her first love and gained a husband she could never completely trust. Michelle establishes a victim advocacy program in David Morrison's name, focusing on families affected by identity fraud and long-term deception. The work provides purpose while helping her process her own experience of discovering that her entire family history was built on lies. She speaks at conferences about the psychological impact of genealogical fraud, how DNA testing can solve crimes, but also shatter families who discover that their foundations were never as solid as they believed. Tommy eventually returns to Cedar Falls for the dedication of the memorial garden, bringing his teenage daughter to see where her grandfather lived and died, where her great-uncle was buried and forgotten, where the complicated mathematics of love and deception played out across 3 generations. Standing beneath the old oak tree, he finally begins to understand that families can survive even the most devastating truths if they're willing to build something new from the ruins of what came before. The memorial plaque reads simply, "In memory of David Morrison, 1944-1968, and in recognition that truth, however delayed, honors both the dead and the living." Visitors often leave flowers there, wildflowers like the one Sarah pressed in her Bible, small acknowledgements that some stories are too complex for simple judgments about guilt and innocence, justice and mercy. Michelle visits the garden on quiet Sunday mornings, bringing her grandchildren to play beneath the oak tree while she tends the flower beds her mother would have loved. She's learned to accept that she was raised by a murderer who loved her genuinely, that her family was built on deception that somehow produced real affection, that the most important truths about human nature can't be resolved through DNA testing or legal verdicts. Some wounds never heal completely, but they can nurture something beautiful if tended with enough patience and care. The Morrison family legacy continues, marked forever by tragedy but not defined by it, proof that even the most carefully buried secrets eventually demand their place in the light.